Readers Entertainment Radio presents Book Lights with your host, author Lisa Kessler. Book Lights, where we're shining a light on good books.
Good morning, everyone, and happy Valentine's Day, or as my daughter used to say, this is SAD, Single Awareness Day. Either way, whatever it is that you're celebrating out there, I am so glad that you're here with us today because I have a fantastic writer on today, Christopher Rice, and if you have never met him before, you're in for a huge treat. And if you haven't listened before, I'm Lisa Kessler, your host, and I also write paranormal romances, and that's how I met Christopher. We were on a panel together, and he's just fantastic. So if you haven't read his books yet, I'm going to read his bio here, and you can get to know him. Christopher Rice is the recipient of the Lambda Literary Award and is the Amazon charts and New York Times best-selling author of A Density of Souls, must read, guys, Bone Music, Bone Echo, and Blood Victory in the Burning Girl series, as well as Bram Stoker Award finalist The Heavens Rise and The Vines. He is an executive producer of The Vampire Chronicles and The Lives of the Mayfair Witches, the AMC television adaptations of the best-selling novels by his mother, Anne Rice. Christopher and Anne also penned the novels Ramses the Dam, The Passion of Cleopatra, and Ramses the Dam, The Reign of Osiris. And together with his best friend and producing partner, New York Times best-selling novelist Eric Shaw Quinn, Christopher runs a production company, The Dinner Partners. Among other projects, they produce the podcast and video network, which can be found at the Dinner Party Show, and I did include a link there right on the Blog Talk site. So if you're listening live or if you're listening later, you can click that anytime and go check it out. I promise they will make you smile. He lives in West Hollywood, California, and writes tales of romance between men under the pseudonym that we're going to talk about today, C. Travis Rice, and you can learn more at his website, which I also included a link right there, so you guys can sign up for his newsletter and see what else is up. And I don't want to delay anymore. Christopher, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you. Happy single, what did you call it? Single Awareness Day?
Singles Awareness Day, yes. yes, sad.
Well, you know, you mentioned Eric Shaw Quinn, my co-host and producing partner, and he takes the attitude that, you know, if you are single on this day, you are completely off the hook. It's a holiday for you, you know.
Oh,
so
that
I
is
prefer,
true.
given
Yeah.
that I am single, I'm going to lean into the holiday side of it. And so anyway, thank you for having me on. It's always good to be here. I enjoy coming on your show.
Oh, thank you. I love having you here. And we always, usually the show is 30 minutes, but we always go way over. So I set it for much longer. So we can talk as long as we want today.
Okay, great. Excellent.
So first up, you have a new book, and for those, I'm sure everyone has heard the news, but Anne Rice passed away before this book came out that you wrote with her, Ramses the Dam, Reign of Osiris. And so do you want to tell everybody about the book, and can they read it as a standalone? Do they need to read the other books?
Oh, you know, that's always the question that our publisher does not want us to answer honestly, and that I feel compelled to answer truthfully. And the answer is yes, they really should. This is really a series in that sense of the word. I guess the word is serialized, right? The original novel, Mom published in, I think, 1990. It was tonally somewhat different from her other work. It was more of an adventure story. It was very romantic and galloping, and, you know, this not to diminish any of her other novels, but it wasn't quite as dark as the Vampire Chronicles. It was a brighter world. It was set in Edwardian England, and it was meant to be a tribute to, stylistically at least, some of the great H. Rider Haggard tales and Arthur Conan Doyle tales, that had first sort of explored, you know, the relationship, I think, a somewhat limited relationship between the West and ancient Egypt, particularly during that period of archaeological discovery that was around the Napoleonic era. And that gave birth to a sort of body of adventure fiction and scary stories that gave birth to what we know today to be the modern Mummy story. And Mom went to Hollywood essentially, this was in, I think, the mid to late 1980s, to pitch her take on that, which was, while steeped in atmospheric history, very contemporary, very diverse, very inclusive, and very much about the Anne Rice way of flipping the point of view and making the character who was previously dismissed as the monster into the hero and the emotional, sympathetic center of the story. And that is what she did with The Mummy in that book. Hollywood ultimately didn't bite, so she went and she wrote it as a novel. It was published in 1990. And the idea was that when the mummy wrappings came off, what was underneath was not some growling zombie-like monster who just stalked white people for pages and pages. It was this gorgeous, soulful, wise immortal who had consumed this elixir of life that had allowed him to live for thousands of years. And when he wanted to rest, he would cut himself off from the sunlight and go into his sarcophagus, and he would sleep. And when you exposed him to the sunlight again, he would rise. And so that was the basis of the book in 1990. And what happened in terms of the sort of history of Anne Rice is that a novel called The Queen of the Damned was published pretty close to The Mummy, and it took off on a level that I don't know if anyone could have predicted. It was just a monster bestseller. It changed our lives overnight. They were selling it out of the box in the bookstore. It earned back its advance in 24 hours. I mean, it was just the sort of success that writers dream of. You know, I'd love to have that kind of success. So nobody cared about mummies. All they wanted was vampires. So poor Ramses was shuttled off to the side as this paperback original. And eventually the drumbeat for a sequel was so steady and so consistent, and the book sold over 1 million copies. And a few years ago, she turned to me. She'd been trying to get me to develop it with her for television for a long time, or for film, you know, and I had been like, I don't want to. I was working on other things. But when she said, let's write a sequel together as a novel, then my ears perked up, because I thought that was an exciting opportunity. So we did that with The Passion of Cleopatra, which came out a few years ago, and then we followed it up with The Reign of Osiris, which came out a few months ago.
And I wanted to ask you, because, well, I sort of already know, because it was so fun last time, but I asked you about working with your mom and the editing. And I know on Cleopatra, you had told me it was the first time you ever received edits that said more hats.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So what kind of fun editing stories did you get from your mother writing these books?
Well, the interesting thing, I don't want to give away the central premise of the third book, but it is her idea, right? It was what she wanted to do next. She said, I want this to happen, and it's a major, what you'd call a tentpole event in a story. You know, like it is the event around which everything else is sort of organized narratively. And the other side of it was that she would have these fascinating insights. She wouldn't necessarily get very plot heavy with me, you know, when we were brainstorming and whatever, because Anne didn't really think in terms of plot. That's not how she organized her stories. Anne thought in terms of the central character, the central point of view, what was extraordinary about them, what would define their narrative voice, all these sort of things. I would be the sort of plot guy saying, well, we need a villain and we need a conflict. I would sound like this obnoxious studio executive in the room. Right. Where's our narrative tension? But what she would say was, she would give some incredible insight to what someone as old as Ramses might say about the new time period that he found himself in. And she was very committed. The books, as I said, are set in Edwardian England, but also past Edwardian England. We're gearing up for World War I at the close of book 2. Which meant book 3 was going to have to deal with the war. And I was just sitting there thinking, and she was committed to it. I mean, we could have always put all the characters to sleep for 100 years and woken them back up with the sun in a different century. But she said, no, I want to deal with the war. And she said the thing that I think that was galvanizing her about that idea was that Ramses' perception of what war was versus what it had become was going to be interesting to explore. And she came up with, we were sitting around the dinner table, she came up with this line that she wanted to put right in his mouth, because World War I is just a horrible loss of innocence event for the world. I mean, it wiped out a generation of royal families. It maybe in some sense some of them were in need of being wiped out, but it was just a turning point in history that is cloaked in mud and loss and death and grief, you know. So I just thought, how are we going to maintain the galloping romance and elegance of the previous two books in this atmosphere of just sort of dreadful loss, as I said. But she said, Ramses would look at this, right, this change in warfare, and he would say, the old way of conducting war in my time as a pharaoh was that when the king went onto the field of battle, and when the king fell, the battle was lost. Now that's completely gone. The king doesn't go on the field of battle. We've invented these terrible war machines that can make battle last forever. Like, he would have these great emotional insights. And so what happened was we began to form a book that was about what it would mean to be an immortal during this time of great loss for all the mortals around you, and to feel like you could not intervene, that you could not stop it, but that you had to let it unfold, you know, because you know, that would be terrible, a terrible torment.
Right.
So, but naturally, the story that we found was, what is the one way in which they simply must intervene? What is the one thing they must stop? And, you know, without giving too much away, it is somebody else's attempt to introduce a supernatural element into the field of battle. They decide that because they are supernatural beings themselves, they must put a stop to that. They must sort of preserve the sanctity of human events. And so that's where the book took off, and I think that's where we found compromise around my complete freak out about having to write a book in World War I.
I love that. And that kind of leads into my next question was going to be, did you guys have more planned, or do you feel like it's, you know, the nice completion of this series? Well,
you know, I'm having one of those moments where people are saying it feels like a nice completion. So that's definitely something that I'm listening to. You know, I think that there are no further plans for books at this time.
Okay.
I think that, you know, this is, you know, with immortal characters, there's always that sense they can go on forever, right?
Right,
but at some
exactly.
point you have to ask do you have the right story? You know, do you have the right story? And I think, you know, I no plans at this time, but I think hoping that people who have not discovered the first one go back and discover the first one, because maybe they want to read it before they read these two. You know, I thought it would be excruciatingly painful to release a book after she had died, and there were aspects of it that were very painful, don't get me wrong, but there was also this wonderful sense of, you know, she's not gone, right? You know, this idea that just shortly after her body left us, we had this piece of work to put out into the world, and people could congregate around it online and talk about it. You know, and that was, ironically, it was very healing. I don't use that term frequently or lightly, but it was to be able to have that to talk about rather than just sharing images from her funeral, which was also something we thought was important to do with her readers and the people who loved her work. But I'm glad it wasn't the only thing we had to do to keep her memory alive.
Exactly. Yes, I agree. And not to get, you know, too woo-woo out there, but when I got to meet Ray Bradbury, he was talking about the way to be immortal is to be a writer, because he said your words will live on, you know, and I feel like I mean, you know this, we've talked about it before, but Anne was probably the inspiration behind me writing. And way back in the beginning of the internet in the 90s, when they had the user, you know, the net groups and things, and you know, Anne was such a huge inspiration, and knowing that she is going on, and, you know, that she's not lost, she's not gone, you can pick up her book and she's alive again, you know. And for me, that is powerful, you know, that words are powerful, and she isn't gone.
No, I think you're right. I think words are very powerful. I really do. And I think, you know, I think that Ray Bradbury is right. It is the way to be immortal. You know, I think art is the way to be immortal. It doesn't necessarily just have to be writing.
That's true.
But I think there is something, even in this media-saturated age in which we live, I think there is something about the intimacy of the written word which allows that
right.
immortality to thrive to an even greater extent than it would with a movie or a television show or a sculpture or a painting. You know, not to diminish any of those things, but there is this sense
right.
of, particularly because Anne so often wrote in the first person. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was, I think, that was when she was at her strongest. It was really her genius with how am I going to channel the first person voice of an extraordinary point of view, of an exalted, extraordinary, supernatural, otherworldly point of view, and how am I going to make it feel as authentic and real as I possibly can? And so when you're in that, when you're living in that and reading that, it is like she's come alive again.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and it really is. It is a magic, and it's kind of interesting talking about the written word. And she loved all of these, you know, ancient old things. And you think about digging up a mummy, and they find all these hieroglyphics, and the person is alive again because, you know, you can transfer these words that are thousands of years old, and you know, and now, and that's kind of the mystery behind the whole mummy thing is always that, you know, you accidentally read the text that should never be read, and then he's awake.
Yes.
You know, kind of magic.
Yeah, and I think, you know, and there's something really sort of it's a cautionary tale, but it's also, you know, and there's a little bit about it that feels dated in its original form to us today. You know, like you know, the brown people are so inscrutable that white people can't come to understand them and educate themselves about them without being destroyed. You know, to be pretty reductive about it. And I think there's such a delightful and a progressive contrast between that and Anne's idea that the past can enfold you with great wisdom and romance and insight, you know, and it's sort of like the quote that we began to use it around her passing and around the images of her passing because other people began to use it in writing about her death. But it's a quote from the Mummy, and I'm sure you've seen it on our social media posts, in which she says, or she has a character say, I imagine that heaven is a vast library rather than one dull answer to all our questions, you know? And so it's one of the reasons it was always challenging to describe her as a horror writer, you know, because I think you can find a lot of people who will agree that Interview with the Vampire reads like a horror novel because it is told from the point of view of an unwilling victim, in essence, you know. The extent to which Louis is willing or isn't willing is sort of up for debate among the fan base, you know, like, but but when you get into Lestat's point of view in the later novels, when you get into the points of view of people who are reconciling their evil empire nature with a value system, with some sort of moral code, when you get to the blood communion in the later book, you're talking about people who are trying to not absorb the horror, but to contend with it and to make peace with it and to make a life alongside of it, as opposed to and I don't mean to disparage horror novels. I've written horror novels, and I'm a big fan of some of Stephen King's work and other horror novelists, but they are about really having everything torn away from you. You know what I mean? And that is a moment
and how you survive.
Of the characters. Exactly. Survival stories. Like, think about The Walking Dead, where it's just like the question again and again is, why do we go on, right? You know, why do we go on? Why keep going when everything is falling apart? But with the vampires, I think it moves past that into, you know, onto a bigger canvas, if you will.
Right. Definitely. And I wanted to ask you, because I was poking around your website and online, and Anne Rice, of course, has the People of the Page, the big Facebook page. And I saw that you have decided to continue to keep it open and keep conversations going and that kind of thing. You know, how did you come to that decision, or is that what Anne wanted, or what are your plans?
You know, I think it is what Anne wanted. I have to say, you know, Anne wasn't planning to go. You know, it was you know, there were aspects of her death that were very sudden, and you know, and so a specific conversation about the Facebook page didn't happen, unfortunately. But what did happen is that, you know, in her later years, she hadn't quite been able to keep up with it as much as she had in the past. She was such a prolific Facebook poster And so she had brought in a social media team. She had brought in a social media team, which we're still making use of to sort of keep the page alive. I think I saw a responsibility to her fans and to her readers to keep it alive for them, because it was so driven by their participation. I mean, it was when it was at its peak, Anne really made it personal and intimate and constant. She was very responsive to people. And so the ideal will be if I can create something in which the community can talk to each other in a respectful way. And so I think what I'm thinking about is I will go on there on a very regular basis, but I will go on there in the short term, probably to post about great movies that she loved and great books that she loved. That was the thing that the team got again and again when they took over. People wanted to know, what is Anne watching? Because she would always go on there and she would post her recommendations. And I think there's a great hunger for that, given how much content there is out there right now. Like, that we want it curated. We do want recommendations lists, because you go on Netflix or you go on HBO Max and there's just endless stuff to scroll through. And you're like, somebody tell me what to watch. It's not like the days where we have 3 networks and 2 big movies.
One channel.
Right. And so she would do that for people. And I think now, we want to sort of spotlight and highlight what really impacted her and what she really loved. And that was most of my great conversations with her over the past few years were about what we were watching. She would text me and she would text Eric Shaw Quinn, and we would have a thread going. And she would write, and I didn't like a lot of what she liked, and she didn't like a lot of what I liked, but the page will be about focusing on what she really loved. And so that's my plan. But, every day I think, what's the best way to keep this thriving? And I'm open to feedback. If people on the page give it to me, I'm open to feedback. So.
Yeah, and there is a post on there that I wanted to alert people about, that where you were asking for, Anne quotes that maybe should go, on the side of the mausoleum by by your dad's poems. And I was reading through some of those, and there, of course, are many magical, amazing quotes that Anne wrote. But but I want to put in a vote for my favorite.
Oh, cool. Please do. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's from Pandora, which was, one of her other vampire novels that was loosely connected to the Chronicles, but it actually was one of my most favorites because her relationship with Marius, it was so interesting. It was one of the only vampire chronicles focused on how would a deep love survive immortality, and how they would come together and go away and all that kind of. It was really interesting. And she had a quote in Pandora that said, "You do have a story inside you. It lies articulate and waiting to be written behind your silence and your suffering." And that has always haunted me, because I feel like that's all the writers, we all have to dig into these sore spots, and that's where the stories are, and I just thought that she articulated that so perfectly of, that everyone has a story to tell, and that's where it's hidden. And I thought that was, so that's my vote.
Okay, I will take note of it. I think you are not the first person to do that quote. I think there are a lot of other people advocating for it too. So,
oh, good.
We will take it under advisement for sure. Yeah.
Go Team Pandora.
Go Team Pandora, exactly.
So I wanted to ask you about your new pen name. So when I was reading your bio, there's all these great books that you've written, and they're just fantastic. And most of them are in the thriller kind of genre and a couple horror novels. But you also had written some really steamy romance novels, because I read them, so they're highly recommended. But now you're bringing out a pen name for that. And so do you want to tell everybody what the purpose is and, what kind of books you're going to be writing under C. Travis Rice?
C. Travis Rice is romance between men, period. And I think the reason I thought it's an acknowledged pen name, right? Because as you said, I've already published romance novels, so it's not about trying to erect some cover for the fact that I'm doing this. I love romance novels. I love romance novel writers. I've been a member of the community now for several years, and it's one of the best decisions I ever made. This, a Christopher Rice novel can be a lot of different things. It could be supernatural. It could be a collaboration with Anne. It could be a steamy paranormal romance novel. C. Travis Rice novel is pretty much always going to be one thing. It's going to be a contemporary, and watch. Now in a few years, I'm going to do a historical under this pen name.
I know,
throw
right?
This interview off whack. But it's going to be a queer male romance novel with a contemporary vibe for the foreseeable future. This was really me wanting to do something I had never done before, and to not feel like it needed to be tweaked or changed every time out. And so on March 1st, I will be launching the Sapphire Cove series under this pen name, and some of the influencer boxes are landing with bookstagrammers, book talkers now, which has been great to see. And it is, as my friend who read it said, you wrote a Nora Roberts novel with two dudes. And I was like, damn right. That's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted it to feel like, and I'm doing revisions on the second book right now, and I will write them for as long as I humanly can. So it started as a passion project. It started at the beginning of the pandemic when I couldn't leave the house and I was home alone because I'm single and I have no kids or pets. And I had a lot of time to kill. So I decided to work on two books at the same time. I was working on the third Ramses book in the morning, and then I would take some sort of break. And then in the afternoon and evenings, I would work on Sapphire Cove. And I started writing it without any real clear plan for what I was going to do with it. I thought maybe it'll be an indie project and I'll do it myself. And I started having conversations with my friends at Blue Box Press about it. And they're also in charge of the project known as 1001 Dark Nights, which a lot of romance fans know. It's a cross-marketing effort in which a bunch of authors publish individual novellas and promote each other. And Blue Box had a phenomenal success, I think, in 2020 it was, right around the pandemic, with Jennifer Armentrout's From Blood and Ash. And so they were moving into standalone titles at a level that they hadn't really done previously. 1001 Dark Nights has been their focus, and they had done a few standalones outside of that. But this was really, really got everybody's attention. And so I knew that they would allow it to be the type of romance novel that I wanted it to be. And my concern was, based on my survey of the marketplace, that while it's been absolutely wonderful to see a lot more LGBT romance happening from traditional publishers, there can be certain rules about the sex. And we all know this from romance. We know if it's a mass market, you can have really explicit sex. If it's digital, you can have really explicit sex. But as they raise the format, if you're not super established in the genre, if you're trade paperback or hardcover, it starts to turn into metaphors below the belt. And I thought, I don't write sex like that. So I wanted it to speechy, romancy read, but I wanted my sex scenes to have a lot of steam. So, and I knew that Blue Box would be comfortable with that. I knew that Blue Box would support me in that. And it's been a wonderful experience so far. I think the neatest part about it, which came as a surprise, was that, we were able to, I said I wouldn't sell the audiobook rights unless they agreed to use me as the narrator on the first release. And I assumed everybody would say that thanks, but no thanks. And, my plan was Eric Charquin and I have our TDPS podcast recording studio. I was going to we were going to produce the audiobook independently. And Brilliance jumped. Multiple people actually jumped at the chance to get the rights with me as the narrator. And that felt great. And so I just recently finished recording the audiobook for Sapphire Sunset, which will come out at the same time as the print book. So, yeah.
I love it. Congratulations. And it's too funny because I had written down here in my notes that I wanted to ask you about narrations because I knew you had narrated a film and a documentary. And so I wondered if you had ever thought about narrating for your own books, and you're doing it. I love that.
And I'm doing it. In my head, I'm doing a terrible job. You know how that is with anybody who's a sort of anxious artist. Like, I'm too nasally. I sound like Bucky Beaver. All the things the kids used to say about my voice when I was younger started to come up, you know. But I'll tell you the most interesting part of the experience, you know, has been to read them. This is what the director said to me when I was reading, because the two heroes, one is this sort of big, muscly former Marine, and the other is a sparkly, proud, you know, gay man who doesn't care what anybody thinks of his kind of gender presentation. And the director said to me, if we had a straight actor read this character the way you're reading them, and I was reading him with utter conviction and authenticity, we would probably get criticized, right? We would be accused of, you know, an unflattering depiction of a gay man. And I was like, you know, just let anybody try to come for me over my own authentic depiction of this boy that I'm completely crazy about and would chase across a bar if I met him in public, you know, because anyway, so we'll see. I'm a little, it's a new thing and I'm a little braced, and audio people can be really particular and specific in their reviews of stuff.
Yeah, but I think it's really cool that I always love books when it says narrated by the author. Well, usually I do. But I think that you're so close to it and you knew how they sounded in your head. So it's fun as a listener to, you know, get that pure vision of what the author was hearing, you know? Right,
totally. Here's hoping. That's my goal.
That's your plan.
That's my plan.
So is it going to be a series then? You said you're already editing book 2.
It is going to be a series, but I will say this, it will be a series in the way that a romance is a series. You know, I've done some serialized series, like our previous conversation about the Ramses books. You know, Sapphire Cove is going to be designed for people to jump on at any point in time. And what I may do is, if I want to continue the stories of earlier characters, that might happen in things that are contained so that the regular readers can enjoy them. But I think, you know, I love the idea, you know, harkening back to what Nora Roberts did, and in some sense with the Chesapeake Blue stories, although there is a sort of unifying storyline that, you know, that with their foster child that kind of unites all of that. So, but really, like, I have had some series where people have said, you got to start at book 1. And if you can't get people to start at book 1, you don't get the readers. So, so I really, the main character is this gorgeous beachfront resort in Orange County. That's really the main character of Sapphire Cove, the main recurring character, because I am a total setting and atmosphere junkie. Like I often make my reading choices based on where do I want to go. Do I want to go to the Southwest? Do I want to be on the East Coast? No, I don't want to be in the Mountain West right now. I want to be in Florida. You know, like I just love being transported in that way, and I love the writers who transport me.
Right. Well, and I was going to ask you, too, if you have fun switching hats between writing romance and writing thrillers, because it's a big genre shift. And so do you, when you sit down at the keyboard, are you, you know, popping off one hat and putting on another, or, you know, how hard is that for you to shift gears?
Well, you know, I have a thriller coming out in May that I also wrote during the pandemic called Decimate, and it's coming out from Amazon Publishing and Thomas and Mercer, and it was much darker than the romances I was working on. And there were times where, to go back to that process I described earlier, where you're working on one book in the morning and one book in the evening, if books are different, that's actually easier because you're not doing same all day long, right? And that shift can happen at the break in the middle of the day. And that was the contrast between Ramses and Sapphire Sunset. But there are times where, honestly, it is a book's level of research that can determine the amount of total focus I have to give it. And so switching back and forth sometimes it doesn't work on a daily basis if the book is really heavy and a lot of stuff that I have to, you know, that afternoon where I would write something else is sometimes spent filling in the gaps in my existing research. So that's kind of how Decimate felt. But, you know, all that said, I love the switch back and forth because, like I said, I don't want to get too bored, you know?
Exactly.
But the best way I find to fine-tune the gears for that switch is in your recreational reading. Like, it becomes a great excuse to, well, I've got to do some romance work, so I'm going to start reading a romance. You know, it becomes like I said with the curation thing, it becomes a sort of a guide for you.
Yes. And we had talked in email, but I have my first thriller horror coming out in May, and I had written it years ago, but I put it in a drawer. Yeah, I put it in a drawer because I've been writing paranormal romances, and you know, the agents like you stick with what you're doing, but now that I'm doing so much more indie, I feel like it's time. And as I edit it, I'm like, oh, I miss being scary. This is so fun. So I definitely am feeling you on, it's nice to have both sides, you know, to have a romancy side, but also have a scary side. It keeps things from being boring for sure.
Absolutely. Congratulations. That's really exciting. I think that, you know, as you probably felt, there's always a weird amount of heebie-jeebies about doing something you've never done before. You know, like
very scary.
But I just try to think of Nora Roberts and J.D. Robb. You know, like, it's like there's a track record of authors I don't want to be that author who can only do one thing. You know, maybe it's an ego thing, but I want to be versatile. You know, if there's one thing that's really working, you know, if it's working, I don't want to quit it, you know, or betray the readership for it. But at the same time, I want to be able to branch out and experiment.
Yes, for sure. Because you just don't want to be stagnant. You want to try, you know, new things. And it is scary, but I think it makes you more well-rounded, right? At least that's what I'm hoping.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping for that for you, too. I think you're going to have fun.
Thank you. That's totally my plan. So
good.
Before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you about maybe. I know Anne had a lot of themes in her writing, and I'm sure that comes out in the Ramses the Dam book. But what do you feel about your themes? Because yours are probably different from your mom's, right? What themes do people find in your books?
You know, my agent summed it up about my first manuscript she ever read. She said the premise was secrets can kill. And I think even when I'm writing lighter stuff, and particularly Sapphire Spring, which is the second Sapphire Cove novel I'm working on right now, the idea is that you have to find a way to be who you truly are, or you will not be happy. And in a romance context, you will probably not find love. And that's really, that journey is what captivates me. It's different from Anne's themes, you're right. Anne always praised me for being a more contemporary writer than she was. She said that she didn't have the ability to process her high school through her work, that she didn't really have the ability to write about what was happening immediately all around her, that she had to process it through her love of history, through her desire to look back through the mists of history itself. You know, that was, I think ultimately she was processing all of that stuff, but she did it in a very different way. And she didn't really write what she called pedestrian realism, you know, which is a term that's about, well, it's how a lot of really popular stories
the mundane.
are told. You know, I woke up, I looked, the mundane.
In your world.
Where it's laced with the mundane, and you find the story that's underneath what appears to be mundane. She was much more about the exalted and the extraordinary point of view. So, but I'm very much about that, and that's tied up in being a gay man and needing to come out of the closet at a young age, feeling like I needed to at least. Seeing the costs and consequences of people leading double lives, you know, all of that is present in my work, even when I am not writing about sexuality specifically.
Right. And were you able to merge that with her, you know, with her vision when you wrote with her on these Ramses books?
You know, I think it was kind of already there in the Ramses books, because what was fascinating to me about the first novel was that when Ramses is reawakened in Edwardian London, I really need to stop saying that because King Edward had already died by the time the first book, but we're like the King George hadn't really culturally taken over yet. But anyway, in that period, it's still somewhat of a repressive environment. And then in comes this gorgeous, mythical, soulful, impossible, supernatural figure who has none of the social constraints of any of these aristocrats who surround him, and his presence and his intrusion into their life upsets all of those oppressive systems, right? And
right.
There's a bisexual character, Elliot, who becomes more in tune with who he is and explores his sexuality more as a result of meeting something as impossible as Ramsey. So I think that idea was already there, and certainly I tried to bring it out more over the subsequent novels.
Right. So she kind of laid a foundation for secrets to be there, and then you got to exploit it, right?
Yes, absolutely. But I think, her theme was much more predominantly, you have to make peace with the fact that we're all going to die. That was really
right.
you have to come to terms with mortality. And even the immortals are making peace with the fact that everyone around them is going to die and they're not. And so in some ways, the curse of immortality is more grief than any human would ever endure. And so
right.
there is a meeting point for those ideas, I think, because you're only going to have so long. So how much time are you going to give to your secrets, Right. And so anyway,
right.
and I think, I could go on all day, but I think you get the idea.
Well, thanks so much for being here today. It was so much fun. And yeah, we could have talked all day, but you'll have to come back again and we'll talk about more things.
You caught me at peak caffeine level. So yes, thank you for indulging me. Right.
It was wonderful fun. And again, I'm so sorry for your loss, but I do feel very strongly that, Anne didn't leave us. She left us with a plethora of amazing words for everyone to dive into. And I hope everyone listening
Indeed.
will go grab The Mummy and read them in order, because Ramses the Dam and the Cleopatra book, they are fantastic. And I love that you got the opportunity to do that with your mom. What a special thing.
It was very special, very special. I feel very blessed.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for being here, and everyone go grab the book and watch for Sapphire Sunset. I can't wait to read it, and thanks for being here, Christopher. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you, Lisa. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us on Booklights. Be sure to connect with us at www.readersentertainment.com for articles, blogs, videos, and podcasts that matter to readers.